Hey guys, Adam from realworldworship.org here, and today I want to talk about the idea of worship titles, um, worship leader versus music director versus worship pastor. It feels like I've been hearing a lot more chatter about this subject, whether it's in worship leader Facebook groups, blog posts, Instagram. I've heard a lot more talk about this idea in recent weeks. Now, I've been trying to think of why that is, and part of the reason I think is that the internet allows us to connect and have connection between groups and groups of churches and styles of churches that previously were unconnected. And now I don't even just mean pre-internet, because the internet's been around for a long time now. But the way that Facebook groups and such have allowed us to connect in a brand new way. You know, when Facebook first came out, I was able to connect with people I knew. And then I started connecting with people I hadn't seen in a long time. But then when Facebook groups really became prominent, I was able to connect with people that I didn't know, but we had a common interest. And so as there's more connection between groups, we're trying to figure out what we all mean. Part of the problem is that with this increased cross connection between groups, we use the same words, but we may not mean the same thing. For example, the other day I saw a discussion about this, and somebody was confused because for them, a music director is the person who is leading the band. They're the person who has a microphone, but it's not going to the front of house, it's only going to the in ear monitors, and they're the bass player, the keyboard player, or rhythm guitar player. And the as the song is going, they're the ones saying, all right, everybody get really big here, or hey, everybody pull back, stop playing, just let the singer sing. They're the one controlling, if you're using backing tracks, they're the one controlling the backing tracks, the click. For somebody else, the music director is the person leading the worship ministry or administrating the worship ministry. So we're using the same term, title, music director, but for different churches, it means totally different things. Part of it too with this cross connection is it's becoming more and more common that somebody could go. This would have never happened just a short, maybe 15, 20 years ago. But somebody can legitimately go from a Assemblies of God church to a Baptist church to a non-denominational church to a Calvary Chapel back to an Assemblies of God church over like a 10-year period. Maybe you're a worship pastor at one church, music director at the next, and you've got all these different titles and what does it mean and what's expected, and you're gaining different experiences because you've been in these different types of churches. And that's just something that's changing, is the way American church culture is changing. And some of that to me is really positive, but it creates these kind of like, well, what does this mean? What am I? Am I a worship pastor? Am I a music director? Am I the worship leader? I'm called, maybe you're called one thing, but functionally you're something else. And that's another thing, is that part of what's going on is that we have this practical reality versus a philosophical reality. For example, maybe a church doesn't call anybody a pastor except the lead pastor, but they're functionally expecting their music director or their worship leader to be a worship pastor. And then maybe there's a church that calls everybody pastor, whether they are or are not. And then somebody who's really not a pastor, they're an administrator, worship leader, band leader, and there's a pressure that's put on them. Um, Also, as we're changing terms too, like somebody has like this philosophical idea, this ideal that says, "Oh, we're all worship leaders." Yeah, that's true. I really believe that. Like this last Sunday, I was not singing. I wasn't the main person. It wasn't. I had picked none of the songs. I wasn't heading any of that up. I was just the rhythm electric guitar player. I still want to lead worship as the rhythm electric guitar player. If I'm not playing, I'm going to be singing. Even in how I act, I want to help lead my church in worship, even though I'm not the worship leader. I'm not the band leader that day. I'm not picking the songs. I'm not the person up front. I'm in the back corner. But at the same time, I recognize I'm not the worship leader. And I am submitting myself to that person's lead. I'm saying I'm going to follow what you're doing. And so we recognize that. So there's this philosophical ideal. Oh, we're all worship leaders. Sure. But the practical reality is that last Sunday morning, I was just the rhythm guitar player. Recently, I had the pleasure and privilege of being part of a panel of lead pastors. I'm a lead pastor at a church in the Portland, Oregon area. And I had the pleasure and privilege of being part of a panel of lead pastors. I was the only lead pastor that has also been a worship leader. So one of the lead pastors had this real philosophical ideal about don't worry about what anybody calls you or what your title is, just go and do what you're supposed to do. And he said that kind of correcting something I had said about just do what your title is. And I understand his philosophical ideal. I agree with it. But practically speaking, there are people that put themselves under pressure that they're not meant to have. For example, I had a ministry leader here at my church who was feeling all kinds of pressure that he was putting on himself. And I said, well, realistically, what are we asking you to do? And realistically, what is expected of your ministry? And you're putting pressure on yourself to do something that nobody's asked you to do. So philosophical ideal is, oh, we're all just putting our full effort in. But practical reality is that this guy works a full-time job and he has kids and a family and all that. And so it's not realistic for me to expect a full-time effort in his ministry leadership. So all these things kind of come into play. I think it's important to define these terms: worship leader, music director, worship pastor, whatever you want to call it. I think for a lot of reasons. One is I think it does free people from unneeded burdens. Like I said, by defining this person's role, you are a ministry coordinator, volunteer ministry coordinator, I was able to free them of certain burdens. When I got here to this church, they called everybody pastor, whether they were a pastor or not. And one of the things I said to our youth leaders, I said, you guys lead our youth ministry, but you're not pastors. And I want to take that burden off you. And it was like a relief for them, because they had been given this title with all of this weight that came with it that they didn't want. They just wanted to love high school and middle school kids and tell them about Jesus. So it frees people of unintended burdens. It also gives clear expectations and accountability. And when I go through in a minute what I kind of think are the expectations and the roles that these titles define, it gives clear expectation. When I was a worship leader, I understood my role. When I was a music director, I understood my role. As a pastor, I understand my role. And so it gives clear expectations, also gives accountability. If somebody's not fulfilling that role, I can hold them accountable and say, this is the role, the title you have been given, and you accepted it, and I need to hold you accountable to fulfill that role. So what are these roles? There are some common but bad roles. Like there is what we would call song leaders. Nobody's ever called that. No, there's no person on a church org chart. Maybe there is at your church, but generally speaking, there's not. That's called the song leader. But this exists. This is somebody who's just playing the song. And we give somebody the title worship pastor, and they're not. They're just somebody that gets up on Sunday mornings on a piano or on an acoustic guitar, and they play a song, and if people sing along, great, and if they don't, well, that's unfortunate. But they're not leading anything. We also have band leaders. That's somebody who just leads the band, and this happens where you have somebody that's called the worship pastor or the music director or something, but they're not. They show up, they have the songs, they lead the band, but actual leadership of worship, that connection between the stage and the congregation just isn't happening, and they have no interest. They're just a band leader. Those are very common things that happen in churches, and by defining roles, defining expectations, we can get rid of these situations that are hindering the growth and the expansion of worship ministry in our churches. So what are good roles? Well, first of all, there's worship leader. And a worship leader is just that. They are the person that is leading worship. They are leading the congregation in worship. They are leading the anyone on stage. They aren't the music director. That frees somebody who, if somebody is working full-time, maybe they're in school full-time, and they only have the bandwidth to be the worship leader. I can show up on Sunday, I'll have my songs prepared, I'll have practiced them, but don't expect me to have an extra rehearsal time. Don't expect this person to go out and recruit new band members or to have training sessions or develop a ministry. That's just not realistic expectation. Um, a worship leader is awesome, and there's somebody who's leading worship, and at every level up, you're still going to be a worship leader. But when somebody is titled the worship leader, all that I expect is that they show up to the service that they're leading worship at, usually Sunday mornings, that they're prepared, and that they're going to lead the congregation towards Jesus. A music director, in the sense of leading the band, is somebody that frees up that worship leader. It is somebody who's the keyboard player, the bass player, even the drummer, somebody who is maybe freeing up somebody who doesn't have the skills to put an arrangement together, somebody who doesn't have the time. They're freeing them up so that the worship leader can lead the congregation and the band is free to flourish. But again, they're not responsible for recruiting, developing, all that. Music director, as far as leading the music ministry, and it's probably good for us to start changing this title because this other type of music director is becoming more and more common. But sometimes they can be the same thing. This is somebody that has administrative responsibility for the worship ministry, somebody that could be, essentially what we would think of as the worship pastor, but they're not a pastor. They don't have that authority. When I was a music director at a church, I understood I had responsibility to grow, to recruit, to train, to increase the music ministry. But if stuff came up, if there was issues going on within the lives of people in my ministry, I understood that I didn't have pastoral authority at that church, which was weird for me because I was an ordained pastor. I had been a pastor at several different churches prior to that, but at that church, they had only asked me to be the music director. By giving me that title, there was a clear expectation and accountability. I understood that there was a role that they didn't want for me. For whatever reason, they didn't want me to operate as a pastor at that church. That gave me certain freedom. And it gave me the understanding to know, okay, this is what's expected of me. And then there were times where something would come up and I would say, you know what, I can deal with this. I could deal with this. It's within my skill set. It's within my calling. But that's not the authority that's been given to me. So I would pass it up to the pastor that oversaw me. And then, of course, if you have a worship pastor, that is a pastor, an elder that's been also a worship leader. And so they are pastoring the ministry. And even if your church doesn't have a worship pastor, let's say that your church, they have one, maybe two or three pastors, but they're the youth pastor, they're the kids pastor, they're the senior pastor, they're the executive pastor. You don't have a worship pastor, you have a music director or a worship leader or something like that. I still think it's important for the pastoral staff to have somebody who is pastoring the worship ministry, who is speaking from the position of a pastor, of an elder, to the worship ministry. Now, there's some fair questions. Well, what if I want more? What if I want to be the worship pastor and they're only letting me be the music director? What if I want to be the music director and they're only letting me be the worship leader? What if I would like to be the worship leader, but they've got me kind of relegated to this song leader function and I want more, but they're holding me back? What do you do? This is my advice, and I would encourage this to be with humility and a humble spirit. When I was the music director at a church, even though I was an ordained pastor and I had been for many years, and I had been a worship pastor previously at other churches, what I decided was the best way for me to operate was to take the responsibility, but not the authority. So if you want to be a music director, but you really are only the worship leader, you don't have the authority to have extra rehearsal time, you don't have the authority to shape the direction of the worship ministry, I can still take the responsibility. And this was one church where they weren't giving me the authority to really increase the worship ministry, but I could still take the responsibility. And so I started building relationship with the youth pastor because the youth ministry was doing things that were unhelpful. I would actually say it was unhelpful to their youth ministry, but it was definitely unhelpful to the main service worship ministry. Well, I didn't have the authority, to do anything about it. So I started building relationship. And I took the responsibility to build relationship so that there was a good relational activity. I didn't have the authority, so I built the relationship. I took the responsibility so that we could make it work between youth ministry and worship ministry. I took the responsibility to invite people and encourage them and pour into them and suggest resources. I didn't have the authority to do this. I took the responsibility, and I still acknowledged the authority above me. I didn't claim authority or title or position. I just took the responsibility to do the work. And that would be my advice, is if you want more, humbly take the responsibility to do the work while still not grabbing hold of any authority that hasn't been given to you. If you do have the authority, then I encourage you to clearly define roles. This is what we expect for our band members. This is what we expect for our worship leaders. This is what we expect if you are on stage. This is what we expect from our music director. I expect this from you so that I can have accountability, and also so that they can have freedom to know, oh, wait, this other thing that I feel like is on me isn't expected of me. One of the things I found when I came here was they had this expectation that they needed to have a strong vocal presence. And I kind of freed them of that. Like, obviously people need to be able to sing, but having somebody who can compete on The Voice or American Idol is not what we are looking for. We are looking for somebody who can lead worship. And that has been a freeing thing for people. So if you are in a position of authority, I encourage you to define the roles in a way that releases people of unneeded burdens, gives accountability, and frees people up with clear expectations. This is the ministry we have for you. And if you are not in the position of authority, but you want more, then don't take the authority. Take the responsibility upon yourself to do the work. And I have found that authority will be eventually given. So hopefully that is helpful. That's kind of my thoughts on worship leaders versus worship pastors versus worship directors, and why we need to have clear and concise titles and roles and responsibilities. Check out realworldworship.org. It's a blog, a website, resources for worship leaders in average everyday churches doing extraordinary things for the kingdom of God. And we hope to see you soon. If you like what's going on here, comment below, subscribe to the channel, check out the website, and we'll see you soon.